Hello, I'm Lynn Prowse-Bishop, and this is the Virtual Business Show. Today we're going to be talking about tax change and whether as a small business owner you should care about it. Over the past few months I've been blogging about some pretty scary proposed tax changes for small business and independent contractors in particular. Sometimes reading about these things can kind of get people a bit bogged down, so I thought I'd dedicate a show to the topic for those who prefer to hear the news rather than read about it. Now, Australia has approximately 2 million self-employed. Small business makes up about 96% of business in Australia, and about 60% of these are non-employing businesses or sole operators. A lot of the non-employing businesses are independent contractors, of which virtual assistants form a part. Currently, the rules are that to qualify as an independent contractor, you need to meet certain criteria. Now, these will include things like the services should be available to the public at large, not just the person to whom the services are currently being provided. The independent contractor should be able to hire others to perform the work, so subcontractors. The contractor should be able to work on more than one contract at a time. The client has little input into how the independent contractor actually performs the services. And of course, as we all know, the 80% rule. The contractor should not receive more than 80% of their income from the one client. If you don't meet these criteria, then the Australian Taxation Office, for tax purposes, deems you an employee, not a self-employed independent contractor. So then, what about the tax changes that are proposed? Even though the proposed changes relate specifically to alienation of personal services income, or PSI, they will capture all self-employed people and independent contractors by forcing them to differentiate between income earned from capital, which is your tools and equipment, and income earned from our labour, with the latter being deemed employees, which will then force many contractors to become employees. Tax deductions for business expenses would be less generous, and businesses employing contractors would be required to deduct tax when they paid their invoices. The rules were reviewed in 2009 primarily to stop people who are, in essence, employees from benefiting from business deductions, income splitting, and tax deferral. Fair enough. And of course, there's a need to capture not only the bogus contractors, but the shonky employers. There was a lot of press coverage in the construction industry, particularly with the no ABN, no job mantra that was doing the rounds, where employers were trying to shirk their responsibilities to employees by bringing them on as a contractor and foregoing superannuation payments and other entitlements. Of course, that's wrong, but the proposed changes are a catch-all, and it will be detrimental to those self-employed contractors who are legitimate. So let me give you a bit of a timeline. In 2007, before the last election, Labor promised not to change current tax laws for independent contractors and the self-employed, but after the election, they instigated a review by the Board of Taxation, which was finalised in 2009. The review was carried out ostensibly at the insistence of the unions, who felt that, and this is a quote, "the legislation has failed to achieve the policy intent of reducing the extent of bogus contracting." Naturally enough, unions can feel rightly threatened by independent contractors since we allow employers to supplement their workforce without union involvement. The report made certain recommendations to the government for changes to the PSI criteria specifically, and some of the recommendations of the review were to introduce a reporting obligation on the payer or the client and or a corresponding obligation on the payee, which is the independent contractor. Another recommendation was to introduce a withholding obligation on payers or clients, similar to the withholding tax for independent contractors with no ABN, with the report recommending that payers withhold on all payments for services provided. Another recommendation was a GST registration requirement, whereby registration became mandatory for all contractors. There was the recommendation to implement a range of criteria to determine if services are provided in an employee-like manner. And another recommendation was amending the results test. Some taxpayers they found were incorrectly self-assessing themselves as meeting the criteria that I mentioned earlier to be an independent contractor, and this particular recommendation added a fourth leg, which effectively required the independent contractor to have at least 2 employees or to apply the test to independent contractors who earned less than 80% of income from one source. These proposals effectively treat independent contractors more like employees for tax purposes. In early August, Assistant Treasurer Nick Sherry wrote to Independent Contractors Australia confirming that recommendations in the review were not government policy. 4 days before the election, the ALP released its small business policy statement, which reasserted its pre-2007 promise to make no changes, but didn't say what it might do in the future. After the election, Craig Emerson was shipped off to another portfolio and ex-union man Bill Shorten was placed in charge of small business. In his first policy announcement after the election, he indicated his focus will be on self-employed tax. Treasurer Wayne Swan's office told the Australian Financial Review in September that the government supported the principles of the Tax Board's recommendation, which were backed up in the Henry Tax Review, but they weren't government policy. In September, the Australian Financial Review revealed that a special committee made up of union representatives, including the CFMEU, AMWU, AWU, TWU, and the CEPU, had met at least 3 times before the 21st of August election with Labor government ministers, including Julia Gillard, Nick Sherry, and Craig Emerson, and whose mandate appears to be to target independent contractors specifically and the self-employed more generally. Now Bill Shorten is saying the government has indicated that the recommendation to consider revising the alienation of personal services income regime is not government policy at this time. Note the addition of the words "at this time." That's changed by stealth, and that's something the sector should be very concerned about. On the 23rd of September, Opposition Minister Bruce Bilson called on Assistant Treasurer Bill Shorten to categorically rule out potential tax changes for independent contractors, calling it an attack on independent contractors and self-employed people that directly contradicts earlier Labor assurances of no change to existing tax laws and explains why the government has avoided stating its true intentions. When Parliament sat for the first time on Tuesday the 28th of September 2010, the parliamentary debate on tax reform had not been formally announced, but is now very clearly on the table for action before June 2011. Independents Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor called for a tax summit next year, and Julia Gillard has promised to convene a public forum on tax by 30th of June 2011 with a debate in Parliament on the subject afterwards. Now, to me, this means that the independent contractor sector has less than 8 months to get our views heard. It's very easy for the public to be lulled into the belief that the government is making advancements with tax reform for business. But remember, the government is referring to big business and what is so-called small business, which they define as having a turnover of more than $5 million annually and/or who employ more than 20 people. Remember the statistics that I gave at the beginning of this show. Small business makes up 96% of business in Australia, and about 60% of that number are non-employing businesses or sole operators. The proposed changes to tax legislation as recommended by the Henry Review will impact non-employing business and the self-employed, so this is our chance to be heard. Let's be clear about this. If the recommendations of the Henry Review are accepted and move forward as government policy and into legislation, the result will no doubt be the closing of millions of independent contractor businesses across Australia. That's a lot of people looking for jobs. Where are they going to find them? Since virtual assistants are, in the main, work-at-home mums, or even grandparents looking after grandchildren and who are getting back into work, that also means a lot more women looking for jobs when VA practices across the country have to shut down. It also means a lot more childcare places needing to be found for those kids whose mums currently stay at home looking after them and running their VA practice. Am I overreacting? Think about it. If proposed changes mean that a client has to, for tax purposes, treat you like an employee and pay superannuation, workers' comp and other on-costs, one of the primary advantages for outsourcing non-core administrative tasks to a VA, the area of cost saving, has just been obliterated. Why would a client contract you if their paperwork has just increased because they have to withhold tax from your invoices and their on-costs just went up? They might as well, employ you. The mining sector is one of the major utilisers of independent contractors. If changes to tax mean independent contractors are looking for work, will the mining companies then have to employ them? Which is the union that looks after the mining industry? That would be the CFMEU. And they were part of the subcommittee of union reps formed to bring down independent contractors. A drop in independent contractors means an increase in employees, and a resultant increase in union dues. I'm just saying. Ministers like Craig Emerson, who understand the importance of our sector, who were for working with independent contractors and the self-employed between 2007 and 2010, and who were encouraging the ALP not to discount the effect that our sector can have on the outcome of elections, are now in short supply and no longer in key positions that can help us. So can anything be done? Well, perhaps naively I believe we still live in a democracy, and despite internal pressures, the Labor government still needs to listen to the people. There are enough self-employed people in key marginal seats for the Labor government to be concerned about winning their votes. And now, with the current tenuous hold on government the ALP has, we probably have our best chance ever at being heard. Contacting your local MP with your concerns is still the best way to be proactive, and I'd recommend contacting the local MP from both camps. The Parliament of Australia website has a great who's who with links to Senators and House of Representatives members, and I'll include a link on the podcast page. Approaching the independents, who will no doubt be a critical element of the current government, is another avenue of opportunity. Independent Contractors Australia has a very good boilerplate letter on their site that self-employed business people can use over their own signature. The last 2 paragraphs could be replaced with your own concerns for the ongoing future of our sector, and I'll include a link on the podcast page to that as well. One of the dangers is that self-employed people are more often than not too busy working in their business to be involved in this type of proactive activism. But recent disturbing shifts in the ALP landscape mean that, if not now, then when? Delaying action may result in a lot of people out of work, and I believe in our right to work for ourselves, in our own businesses, free from political and union harassment. Our sector doesn't have a bunch of union heavies who can apply pressure to the government. We have to stand up and be heard and do it ourselves. And isn't that the same spirit that got us out from employment and working for ourselves in the first place? I'm Lynn Prowse-Bishop, and this has been the Virtual Business Show. Please feel free to leave your comments at the show comments page or continue the discussion at my blog, blog.execstress.com. Thanks so much for listening.